So this is the last session of our Stronger Families workshop, and I want to welcome everybody online live right now, those of you at the warehouse over at the fire hall, our friends up in Churchill, wherever you are, and of course here at the factory as we wrap up this series. It's been a great series. We've been doing lots of work together. 4 weeks ago, I introduced you to our mascot, which is a 1951 Chevrolet truck. Like this old truck, we want our families to be built to last. Like this old truck, we want our families to be able to weather every storm that can be thrown at it and still be standing in the end. This old truck has reminded us of what it is to be made strong, and it has also taken us back to basics. And could you go any further back to basics than the book of Genesis? So as a church, we've been reading in our 1,000-day, chapter-a-day reading plan. We've been reading through the book of Genesis. More than a chapter a day. We've been on to 2 chapters a day. We're going to wrap up the book of Genesis, all 50 chapters, this week. But as we come to this, we began our series by looking at the first couple of chapters, and we identified the very first emotion that God ended up telling us about, and it was this whole idea of shame. And so we looked at shame the first week. The second week, we looked at what it means to reject people in our families. And we said, well, how do you reject someone that you're having a meal with every day? But we realized that we don't always see each other. Sawabona, I see you. And I see you seeing me. And we learned what it is to see one another. And then last weekend, we learned what it was to actually develop a strong legacy in our families. And in fact, last weekend, we issued our last social media challenge. And that social media challenge was all about going back in your photo albums and finding pictures of you as a kid with your family and posting the kind of legacy that was left to you. I didn't expect so many entries. We had a pile of entries, which is so cool. All these entries talking about the legacy that was left. So let's check out who our winner is. All right, the Kelly Eileen family, let's give it up for them. And here's what they win from our generous sponsors: a Moose Game package, a bowling package, escape room package, virtual reality gaming, and Grounded Cafe mega prize pack. So you can go to the Welcome Center and collect that. We could not wrap up our series talking about building a stronger family without dealing with the issue of resolving conflict. Resolving conflict is so much a part of what it means to build a family. In fact, one of the themes in Genesis is the absolutely inexhaustible ways that people find to have family conflict and to blow up their relationships and create conflict within their families. And really, we find out that this sort of comes naturally to us. What I mean by that is that all the brokenness and the misunderstanding and the quarrels and the mistakes and the tensions and the hurts and the insults, all of this stuff really is sort of hardwired into our personal DNA as a result of sin. Let me sort of show you what I mean. In our first week, we talked about the very first personal emotion named in the Bible after sin came into the world, and it was shame. Out of all the hundreds of emotions and the pinwheel of emotions, God talks about shame, and we believe that God is saying, look, you are going to have to deal with this issue of shame all the time, and in your relationships, you're going to have to realize that the other person is dealing with shame, and we learned some really practical techniques for dealing with shame. However, a few verses after God talks about this first personal emotion, God begins to reveal the first relational dynamic that is named out in the Bible as a result of sin. And it's actually a very fascinating little study. Genesis 3, verse 16 says this. So God is speaking what's going to happen as a result of sin, first to the woman and then to the man. And he says this: I will make your pains in childbirth very severe, your painful labor, you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he's going to be a jerk and rule over you. Okay, so this is the beginning of the very first relational dynamic, but it's a very, very fascinating little phrase. In fact, it's very curious. Why would God say something like this? It almost seems romantic and sweet. Your desire will be for your husband, but he's going to rule over you. What does that even mean? How is that a relational dynamic as a result of sin? Why would the woman be sweet and romantic and the guy be a jerk? And some of you are saying, well, that's just the way it is. But it's not. It's not the way it is. There's something else going on here. In fact, as we look at the ancient Hebrew word for desire, we see the same ancient Hebrew word in chapter 4, verse 7, and it says this: sin is crouching at the door, and it desires you, is what it says, ready to pounce on you and dominate you and devour you. You must master it before it masters you. So we go back to Genesis 3:16, and a more accurate reading of this verse is this: your desire will be for your husband. You will be ready to pounce on him and dominate him and devour him, and he will rule over you. He will overpower and try to dominate you. The result of sin is that there is going to be tension in relationships. Now, I will admit to you, up until this last week, I've always and exclusively seen that verse as a description of the tension between male and female in a marriage relationship. But as we've been studying families, it hit me, oh my goodness, this is the first ever verse that talks about families and the first ever interpersonal relationship. And what it's saying is this: in your interpersonal relationships, people will naturally, on this side of the sin choice, will naturally pounce on one another, attempt to devour and demolish one another, dominate one another, and overpower one another. And in the same way that you are going to have to learn to deal with shame, God is saying you are going to have to learn to deal with this conflict, relational conflict. And so what we end up with is this book that from chapter 3 all the way to chapter 50 is story after story after story after story after story of broken relationships and conflict. The rest of the book of Genesis. Now, if you hear that and you're thinking, well, actually, to tell you the truth, my family's got a little bit of conflict. My personal, close family, or maybe my extended family's got a bit of dysfunction and a bit of tension in it. I want you to know you are in good company. And I don't want you to feel bad at all, because God told us this is what's going to happen. In fact, as we take a quick survey of the tensions and the relationships that broke down in Genesis, let me fly you through really quick. Adam threw Eve under the bus and blamed her for humanity's sin problem. Adam and Eve's son, Cain, killed their other son, Abel. Do you think that caused some family tension? After the whole Noah rescuing the world on the ark thing, we're told that Noah develops a drinking problem, which breaks up some family relationship stuff. Abraham marries Sarah, but the Bible says that their marriage is full of tension and full of pretty consistent bickering and rivalry, especially after the children come. Sarah ends up giving her husband a surrogate to have a baby, but this all turns out bad, and there's outbursts, and there's fighting, and somebody's either being chased out of the family or kicked out of the family. Sarah ends up blaming her husband for this whole scenario when really it was her own fault. And then we read to the end of Sarah and Abraham's life, and we find out that their marriage, they were living separated. They had a separated marriage. Isaac and Rebekah, their son Esau marries two women that cause nothing. The Bible says nothing but grief and heartbreak for Isaac and Rebekah. And this is just the beginning of their family problems. Rebekah and her favorite son, so she's got a favorite, Jacob, they plot against Rebekah's husband, Isaac, to try and steal the inheritance. Esau, the brother, finds out about this and threatens to kill her brother. Later, Jacob finds a girl, Rachel, who he loves very much. However, Rachel's father extorts Jacob and tricks him for 14 years, and then Jacob finally marries Rachel, the girl he loves, but he's also forced to marry Leah, her sister, the girl he doesn't love. Anything about family tension in that situation? Actually, that breaks out into what I call a baby war. I don't know if you've ever heard of a baby war, but this is where two women, two sisters, try and one-upmanship the other. Leah gives Jacob 4 boys. Rachel can't have children. So she says, here, husband, take my servant girl and make a couple of babies. So they end up with 2 boys. Leah says, hey, you're not going to outdo me with that trick. I'm going to give our husband my slave girl, and she can end up having 2 boys. Leah ends up becoming pregnant again and gives Jacob 2 more boys. And finally, Rachel becomes pregnant, 2 more boys, Joseph and Benjamin, for a total of how many boys? 12. The 12 tribes of Israel. This is where the 12 tribes of Israel came out of. And you think your family's got problems. I mean, my goodness, the brokenness that is in the book of Genesis. In fact, Genesis is a case study in dysfunctional families. But we can also learn a lot about resolving conflict. And in fact, to get us thinking about conflict in our own context and in our own families, come with me and let's have a little bit of a conversation with the Hebert family.
We're the Hebert family, and this is Betsy, my wife, and Gracie, and Aaron, and Evelyn, and I'm Bruce.
And this is my husband, Tyler. My name is Jody. Our daughter is Grace. This is my sister-in-law, Megan, and my brother, Jeremy, and their 2 kids here. And unfortunately, Kaylee and Jarrett and their newest addition weren't able to be with us today. This past Sunday, they gave birth early and unexpectedly to their baby, Jackson, but they're with us in spirit. I feel like when it comes to dealing with conflict, we're like still learning. I feel like we maybe not have honed in on one specific skill on how to deal with that. At least I haven't noticed. I don't know if someone else.
I know there's no pattern.
There's different, there's 4 families in the midst of the bigger family, right? So the way something's being done and the way you would expect it to be done are very different. So sometimes just talking it out, it helps you, or at least helps me understand where people are coming from a different perspective, right?
Talking out between
figure out who's wrong.
Well,
figure out who's wrong.
There's always,
or just validation for that. It was, it's okay to be upset, but I think you get to the point where is this a conflict? Is this the hill that I want to die on today? Is this does it even matter? There's, when you put 2 things together, sometimes they don't always fit perfectly, but it's like 2 jagged things that, they smooth each other out and it works. I don't know.
I want to deal with it as fast as possible and get it over with.
And I'd like to run away from it.
I was going to say, I think our family's overall impression is we'd prefer not to deal with it.
Yeah.
well, and now we're like one big family, including Kaylee and Jarrett, but we're also like 4 separate, smaller family units. So but we still have this whole that we still have to, so it's almost like you have to deal with stuff together and then together.
When we get together, it's all about kind of catching up and hearing what we've all been up to. And so sometimes things don't always get dealt with maybe as quickly as I would like. I like to just move on. But when Bruce and I were going to premarital counseling, they told us not to get married because we were such polar opposites. And here we are 38 years later, almost to the day. Tomorrow is the 24th. That's our anniversary. And it's not always been smooth. I can tell you that. And he would tell you even more.
Same thing.
I feel like we try to model with our kids something that's we try to teach our kids to do something that's hard to do as adults. And so really early on when they would say sorry to each other, and then the other person would say, it's okay, we thought, well, maybe it's not okay actually. And so we tried to say to them, you don't have to say it's okay, but you can say, I forgive you. And then something that we've tried to emphasize with them is just that there's a fresh start. We always say, tomorrow's a new day and it's a fresh start. And God gives us fresh starts all the time. And we're thankful for that. Just on Sunday, Aaron came home from church and he had a conflict with a friend of his at church that he didn't really understand what had happened. He honestly was a little bit confused as to why there was conflict. And we said, I think you need to call him and try and sort it out and just say, hey, I'm not sure what's going on, but make the phone call and see what happened. And you know what, we had to force him to make that phone call, really. But in the end, they still didn't see eye to eye, but they did say to one another, can we start fresh on Sunday? And so that's where they left it. And I think as adults, if we can give each other that grace, that's good too.
Yeah, the Hebert family's here. Can we thank them for sharing just that snapshot? I think it's great. Some of us like to avoid conflict, and we just want it to go away. We want to keep our eyes closed and just let it go away. Others of us, we jump in too quickly, and we say things that we regret, and then that ends up being problems. But I love this little story of Aaron at the end, and I think we're going to find that some of this family's technique was actually used by Joseph in resolving conflict as well. So the story of Joseph. Andrew Lloyd Webber, of course, made Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, 2000 DreamWorks production, Joseph, King of Dreams. Maybe you saw those. Maybe you need a little bit of a refresher on the life of Joseph. So let me kind of speed you through Joseph's life. Joseph, of course, was one of the last kids born to Rachel and Jacob, and ended up being one of the favorites. This caused all sorts of problems, of course, with the other part of the family, the half-brothers that came from Leah. And then Joseph had this habit of dreaming dreams, but instead of just keeping his dreams to himself, he would tell his family about his dreams. And that wasn't so bad, except that the dreams were about his whole family bowing down to him and honoring him, who's the one that is ruling over his family. And this did not go over well at all with his brothers. So one day, there's a complete breakdown of family civility as the 11 brothers are together. Joseph comes, he's outside of the protection, the overprotective care of his parents, and they plot to kill him. One of the brothers intervenes and says, no, let's not kill him, let's just throw him in a pit. So they rough him up, they take his coat, they throw him in a pit, and they decide to sell him to a traveling caravan. He ends up working for a high-ranking Egyptian ruler. And then the Bible says that God saw Joseph and blessed him in the midst of his chaos and circumstance. God blessed him and gave him success and gave him favor. However, one day, as Joseph is working at his boss's house, the boss's wife is there, and the boss isn't there, and the boss's wife begins to come on to him. She wants to have sex with him. And so she's seducing him and chasing him around the house. And Joseph ends up saying, listen, I would never think of doing that to my God or to my boss. But she's relentless. She chases him around. She finally grabs onto his tunic. He has enough common sense to dream forward how this is going to turn out. So he runs away. And he runs away naked, and she is left holding his tunic. And because she has been jilted, she ends up yelling, rape, rape. The security guards come. They find the evidence that he has been too close to this woman. He is framed. He is charged. He is thrown in prison. It says that God favored him even in prison and gave him success and favor. There's a whole story that we're reading through this weekend in our chapter a day reading. I won't go into that. However, he ends up miraculously getting out of prison. He is quickly promoted to the second in command of Egypt and in charge of famine preparedness program. And this is really important because his 11 brothers and their family are experiencing a severe famine, and they come looking for help from Egypt and from their brother Joseph, and they don't even know that it's their brother. They don't know that he's still alive. This is a most fortuitous and ironic turn of events. Years earlier, the 11 brothers had stood around a pit and had looked down at their bloodied and bruised brother who they had thrown in the pit, who they were intending to kill, but they ended up selling into slavery. And now, in a complete reversal, Joseph is standing looking down on his 11 emaciated brothers, and it is payback time. It is time for justice. It is time for these half-brothers to experience the pain and the rejection and the violation and the suffering that they had caused Joseph. So in Genesis chapter 43, Joseph gets this incredible opportunity to even the score and exercise justice. This is in Genesis 43. 7 chapters later, in Genesis 50, we see Joseph posing for a family portrait with his arms around his 11 brothers, and they are laughing, and they are crying, and they are hugging, and it is the most beautiful picture of reconciliation and unity. So what happened in those 7 chapters? What happened from the moment those brothers came and Joseph had his opportunity for payback and this family portrait that is 7 chapters later? Well, this is where the Stronger Families Workshop earns its name, Workshop, because we are going to get practical. And I'm going to teach out for you in the next few moments 6 practical, unlikely, non-typical principles for resolving conflict. You can go looking on the web. You're not going to find this list anywhere because this is straight out of Joseph's life and out of Genesis 43 to 50, and they are non-typical. You might want to keep notes on the Riverwood app. It's your opportunity to take notes. We don't have time to dive into every scripture where these come from. We're just going to kind of summarize it fairly quickly. And here is the first principle. Number one, it only takes one to end the cycle of conflict. It only takes one to end the cycle of conflict. Joseph could have easily have kept the family dysfunction and battle alive, and he could have demanded justice, and he could have tried to settle scores, because for years the verbal and the emotional and the psychological bullets had been flying back and forth in this family, even in their memories. And Joseph realizes that it only takes one to end the cycle of conflict. And when Joseph has his cruel brothers in his sights, and he could have fired that bullet. Instead, he lowers his weapon, he puts the safety on, he removes the bullet, and he throws the bullet away. Because he realizes that it only takes one to end the cycle of conflict. Now, notice, I did not say it only takes one to end the conflict and bring about reconciliation, because that would not be true. It takes two to end the conflict and bring about reconciliation. However, in the lowering of his weapon, the unloading of the gun, and the throwing away of the bullet, he begins to break the cycle, the back and forth cycle of this conflict. Instead of volleying insults and accusations and tactical maneuvering, he stops that by putting an end to his side. And I love how Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 40. A profound verse. Jesus says this: if somebody is going to sue you for your shirt, what do you do? What do you do? What did he say? You give them your coat as well. Think about this for a second. Jesus is saying, instead of lobbying back a defense and trying to hang on to what you have, take control of the conflict. And you take control of the conflict by ending the cycle. Don't just reluctantly hand over your shirt, willingly give your coat as well. What a radical and God-powered approach to conflict. Number two, be more sad than mad. You see, 3 times in these passages we read that Joseph wept. His brothers don't know it's him. And he has them in, and it says this in Genesis 43:30. Then Joseph hurried from the room because he was overcome with emotion for his brothers. He went into a private room where he broke down and wept. Conflict resolution begins when we are more sad about the condition of the relationship than we are about the need to be right or mad at the other person. If there is something inside of you that just has to be right, the conflict will not end. Because our human nature, as a result of sin, is to pounce and dominate and devour and try to rule over others and try to play games with others and try to outmaneuver others and try to be in a place where I am right. However, here is something you will need to answer. Do I value being right more than I value the relationship? Would I rather have a good, healthy relationship or come out right? Joseph comes to the place where he says, I'd rather have a functional relationship with my brothers than be right. And when you give up the need to be right and allow your heart to break for the condition of the broken relationship, it doesn't solve the problem. You don't solve the conflict, but you are taking one more step towards potentially solving the conflict. Practical, unlikely, non-typical principle number 3 of resolving conflict: work to put the other at ease. Work to put the other at ease. Once you have lowered your weapon, unloaded the gun, and thrown away the bullet, now you want to try and help to actually have the other person lower their weapon and to ease the tension. One of the most practical techniques I can think of for doing this is to take the conflict. You see, a conflict usually runs in a ditch or a rut. You're stuck in a rut. They're volleying insults, you volley insults back. They're telling you their logic, you tell them your logic back, and you're both stuck in this rut. One of you needs to make the radical decision to get this thing out of the rut. So how do you do that? You need to involve a radical departure in the tone and the flow of the conflict. Divert the flow of the conflict. So let's make this really practical. Let's say you're having a fight with your spouse about finances. And you're always on each other about the finances. And it's got to the place where there's insults and there's tension. Or maybe it's a fight about a wrongly expressed expectation and words are flying. Or maybe somebody in the marriage has forgotten the birthday, or somebody in the family has taken somebody else for granted, and there's very, very deep issues going on. And you're at each other, and you know the pattern when you're at each other. One of you needs to take that and make a hard, sharp left turn out of the ditch. And the best way I know of doing that is by speaking about another reality. You have this one reality that you're stuck in. Now begin to speak of another reality. You need to know, I love you so much. You need to know that even though I'm feeling hurt right now, I don't want my hurt to outweigh my love for you. I don't want you to miss the message in the midst of this tension. I don't want you to think somehow that I disrespect you, or I don't believe you, or that I'm against you and I'm the enemy. I'm not the enemy. This issue is our enemy. But you need to know that I love you and I believe in you. You need to know that you are more important than me winning this fight. If I could unzip my soul and you could look inside, even though I'm feeling hurt right now, even though I'm feeling frustrated right now, if you could unzip my soul, you'd see that I'm crazy about you. You're my favorite person on this entire planet. And I'm not about to sacrifice that for this conflict. I would never want you to lose that message that in the midst of this tension and the conflict, I love you. It's a radical departure from the rut. And it's saying, you know what, I don't have to win this one, but I'm going to declare what truth is. And what truth is that you are more important to me than this conflict. When you do this unexpected turn, you rocket the conflict out of the rut. You de-escalate the tension. You right-size the issue. Oh yeah, there's something bigger at play here. And you set the other person at ease. We find this. Joseph actually does this. I love this. He says this, please come closer to his brothers. He says to them, and they came close. And then he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to that place. You see what he does? He takes this opportunity where he could have lambasted them for the horrible things they did. And he says, listen, I'm going to put you at ease. Don't be upset. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me into this place. Talk about taking a radical approach and putting others at ease. Number 4, visualize the outcome of a restored relationship. This actually is inspired by last weekend's message about legacy. So Carolyn was teaching about legacy, and she said, here's what you need to do before you end up taking that compromising step that's going to earn you an hour, a week, a month of pleasure, where you actually, and she used the example of cheating on your spouse. Before you do that, just stop for a second, and Pastor Craig Groeschel helped us with this. Stop for a second and visualize what's about to happen after that. Well, when we resolve conflict, we start at the end of that movie, and we run the movie backwards. And we say, if I was to do the hard work of resolving conflict, can you imagine, or you begin to dream, can you imagine the legacy that would be restored? Can you imagine the testimony to God's power that would be written? Can you imagine the trust that would be rebuilt? Can you imagine the intimacy that once again could be ours? Can you imagine the laughter and the celebrations that we could genuinely host? Can you imagine the joy and the adventures that could yet be experienced if we will just do the hard work of breaking through the conflict and not let this conflict set the pace and the tone of our relationship, but rather we will dream ahead to what this could be. Now, I'll admit to you that there's no particular verse I can point to on this one. We know that Joseph was a dreamer, and I believe, I'm speculating, but I believe there was a point at which he went into this and saw his brothers come there and thought, I can either throw them in prison, I can make them pay for what they did, or I can begin to picture that family portrait, a new family portrait that we could have with us 12 hugging each other and loving each other. And I believe that he played forward the movie and he visualized the outcome of a restored relationship. Number 5. Don't only lay down your weapon, but tell the truth. You see, Joseph laid the foundation, the practical, unlikely, non-typical principles of restoration. He realized that it only takes one to end the cycle of conflict, and he would be that one. He decided to be more sad about the broken relationship than mad, and he wept. He worked to put the others at ease and said, listen, don't be mad at yourselves. We can work this through. I believe he visualized the outcome of the relationship. And then number 5, he didn't only lay down his weapon, but he encouraged a telling of the truth. He made it safe to tell the truth. We get this from Genesis chapter 44, verse 16. And this is what it says. It says, then Judah stepped forward and said, please, my Lord, let your servant say just one word to you. So Judah, the brother from another mother who hated Joseph so much he sold him into slavery, now is standing before Joseph and he says, please, my Lord, let me just say one word to you. And he says far more than one word. He goes on for like 15 to 20 verses. And what he ends up doing is unzipping his soul and says, can I tell you my story? Can I tell you what's really been going on? And he begins to do this. He stops playing games. He risks vulnerability. He decides to get it all out. You know, Jesus said in John 8:32, the truth will set you what? Free. The truth will set you free. And Judah decided that he would take the risk with his younger brother that he had violated so horribly, and that he would unzip his soul and he would tell the truth. You can read the story. And he pours out his truth. Do you know what ends up happening? Joseph is so moved by this, it says that he could no longer contain his charade, that because they didn't know at this point that Joseph was their brother. And in the very next verse, the very next chapter, we find Joseph now unzipping his soul and saying, I will tell you another truth. I'll tell you my truth. I'll tell you my experience. And here's what's really going on. They both let their guards down. Instead of shooting at one another, they're letting their guard down and they're telling their truth. A number of years ago, our family of 5 was sitting around the table. Our 3 daughters were much younger than they are now, and I don't remember what the fight was about. All I remember is 5 people, the tension you could cut with a knife, 5 people at each other around the table. It was a bad family moment. And there were words being shared, and there was games being played. Psychologically, people were ducking and weaving, and stuff was flying around. And I remember in a moment of parental desperation, I yelled, enough already! This is not the family we are going to be. I had their attention, but I had no clue what to say next. And they're looking at me. And that's when I spotted a candle in the middle of the table. So improvising, I said, I think it's time that we employed the candle of truth. And they mockingly said, that's not a thing. Now I really had to up my game, and I had to convince them that this was a thing. I said, oh no, listen, it is a thing. Not only is it a thing, I will tell you the 4 rules of the candle of truth. And I began to tell them the rules. Here's the first rule, rule number 1 of the candle of truth. Whoever has the candle is the only one who can speak. Everybody else must listen. Rule number 2, whoever has the candle must speak only truth. Rule number 3, when you are done speaking truth, you hand the candle to somebody else. Everybody gets a turn. Rule number 4, everybody must go. Nobody was more surprised that it worked than me. And we spent the next half hour passing the candle of truth and telling what the truth was. Now, if you as a parent should like to use this brilliant parental technique and you happen to find yourself at a table without a candle, I want to suggest that you use the salt shaker of truth, or the baguette of truth, or the ketchup bottle of truth. You see, the object does not matter. But if you can create an environment and a place where the truth can be spoken, and people know that their words are going to be listened to, and they're going to be respected, and it's a safe place for them to unzip their soul and tell the truth, you will be well on your way to resolving the conflict. Practical, unlikely, non-typical, bit of conflict resolution advice number 6. Only exercise as much grace as you have been given. There's a profound verse at the end when the portrait is being taken. Genesis 50, verse 19. And Joseph says this, "Don't be afraid of me." He sets him at ease. "Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I should punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good." I want to suggest to you that if you have never been blessed when you don't deserve it, if you have never been forgiven even though there's a likelihood of you re-offending, if you have never been given a second, a third, a fifth, a 19th, or a 42nd chance, and if you have never experienced grace that you weren't worthy of, then please, by all means, with that person you are having a conflict with, stick it to them. Play the game, outsmart them, make them pay for what they've done. However, if you have ever been blessed when you don't deserve it, if you have ever forgiven even though there's a likelihood of you reoffending, if you have ever been given a second, third, fifth, 19th, or 42nd chance, if you have ever experienced grace when you have been unworthy of it, then you need to be the person that passes that blessing and forgiveness and second or 42nd chance and grace on to others. I love Joseph's words to his brothers, "Don't be afraid of me. Am I God? Am I God that I should punish you?" Joseph is saying, there is a God, and I know that I am not him. And that God has been so good to me, because even when you made the mistake of throwing me in a pit and discarding me and selling me into slavery, even when that was your intention, God has blessed me beyond what I should be blessed. God has had so much favor on my life, and I've received so many blessings and so much forgiveness. And even when this was in a place where you had made such a grievous mistake, God has been good to me with all my faults and my flaws, with all my pride and my prejudice. So it is incumbent upon me to be good to you. Whether I think you deserve it or not, I can only pass on what I've received. The bottom line is that we've all received unmerited, unconditional love and grace, and therefore we are obligated in the middle of our conflicts to pass along unmerited, unconditional love, even when you're in the middle of it. And I realize that I'm speaking to some of you today who are in the middle of a conflict. It might be a conflict with your spouse. It might be a conflict with a sibling or with a parent or with a coworker, a neighbor. I realize that these words are a little bit offensive. These practical principles can be a little bit offensive because they touch a very deep nerve. But what I'd love to do is I'd love for us to just kind of hold those conflicts up, even right now in our hearts, and to just pray God's grace and mercy over those. Would you pray with me at all of our sites? Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, if every one of our hearts and relationships could be projected on a screen right now, it would probably cause us all to be in shock, the number of conflicts that we represent. And that shouldn't surprise us, because you told us that we're going to have to deal with shame and we're going to have to deal with conflict interpersonally as a result of sin. So God, I want to pray over every tension, every hurt, every unresolved issue, every disagreement right now. And I pray, God, that you would help us to be the ones who realize it only takes one to end the cycle of conflict. Help us to be more sad about the condition of the relationship than we are mad or needing to be right. God, I pray that you would help us to learn to tell the truth, to set others at ease. And then, God, in the end, to realize that we have received so much grace, so much blessing, so much forgiveness, and it is incumbent upon us to be those who pass that along. I pray that we would look at and experience conflict this afternoon, tonight, tomorrow, differently because of Joseph's story. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to invite everybody at all of our other sites as well as here. Would you stand with us right now? And as one church over multi-sites, we want to take a few minutes to respond and worship together.